Hi, my name is Megan Vogt, and I am going to give an informative speech over Lewis Hine's photography and how it was the innovation that impacted and changed child labor in the early 1900s. How many of you have had a job when you were, let's say, 14 to 16? Was it a job that you would like to keep your entire life? I'm willing to bet that over half of you that have had a job at 16 would not keep that job as a career due to the type of work they made you do, the type of hours they made you work, and the type of pay that you were getting. So I'm going to start my speech by introducing just a little bit about when child labor started. Child labor started in the early 1900s and was most common in factories and mills. Most parents worked at the factories and mills as well and would often hire on their children as well just to make some extra income. These children would work often 60 to 70 hours a week for very little pay at the time. While working this many hours, these children were unable to get an education, therefore not being able to build a healthy future for themselves. At this time, the National Child Labor Committee hired a man named Lewis Hine. He was told to go around to different factories throughout the United States and take pictures of the child laborers and try and expose these child laborers to the public to try and get some laws passed. Some of the laws that ended up passing were the Keating-Owen Act of 1916, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. So a little bit about Lewis Hine. Lewis Hine was born in Wisconsin in 1874. He then went to college after 25 years of age and then took a teaching job in New York City. He then married his wife Sarah and took up photography as a hobby. His first assignment was to go and videotape photograph all the immigrants that came in from Ellis Island. From here, he then was hired on in 1908 by the National Child Labor Committee. He traveled around the United States taking photos and was often very shaken by these hardships that he saw. His goal, though, however, was to open the public's eye to the horror of child labor. Lewis Hine ran into a lot of problems, however, while traveling the country taking pictures. He was often imposed by rudeness of the factory managers who didn't want him to come in and take pictures. So he would often dress up as either a fire inspector or an insurance salesman or even just an industrial photographer. And when he did gain access into the thing, it was often very hard for him to take pictures because his equipment weighed a lot, almost 50 pounds with his tripod, his camera, and all of the glass films and stuff. So once he did finally get it set up, he only carried one glass photo with him, therefore only allowing him to take one shot of the action. He also went out of his way and gained more information by writing down the ages and the heights and how long the children had been working in the factories. And he didn't carry around a ruler or a tape measure. It was interesting how he measured the exact height from the ground to each of his buttons on his jacket, and if the children came close enough to him, he could get an accurate measurement of how tall they were. So that was kind of cool. So child labor was most common, as I said before, in the factories and mills and stuff, but children were often hired over adults because they were smaller, they were more flexible, and they were able to perform longer hours for less pay. So the factory workers would hire them over adults. They also had very small hands, which allowed them to fix the small parts on the machines instead of an adult's larger hands. There was a lot of injuries, though, to the children because they wouldn't wear shoes, so they would often walk and crawl across the machines and slip and fall and injure themselves. A book that I resourced by Freeman quoted, "Children working in mills had accident rates of 2 times more than adults," which, I mean, if you can believe that because they're smaller and they get into more trouble, I guess. Canneries, glass factories, and coal mines are also very common sites for child labor. The glass factories had pretty much the same dangers as the other factories, except for children were often paid by the piece of glass that they made. So if one accidentally broke, they didn't take the time to clean it up or sweep it up. They just stepped on it and kept working. So that led to a lot of cuts and everything in their feet. In the coal mines, these jobs were mostly held by younger boys, and they were often called the breaker boys. basically they would sit on top of this wooden board, and the coal and everything would travel underneath of them. They had to quickly pick out the slate and rock and stuff that wasn't going to burn. And so this made for a lot of bending over, which therefore increased their injury to their back and often stunted their growth and inhibited them that way. There was also a lot of breathing problems for the children, no matter what factory or mill or cannery they were in. With all the smoke and the humid air, it just wasn't a good environment for the kids. So when Lewis Hine would take these pictures, they were unable to print them in newspapers and stuff, so they made all these flyers to all the Americans and tried to show it that way. Well, finally the Americans were angered, and a lot of strikes and protests were happening, and which led to the laws being made of, like the Keating-Owen Act, like I had said. But that law regulated that, or actually quoted from the act, said that no products should be sold or bought if they came from factories and mines that employed children. This was kind of hard, and then after 2 years was ruled unconstitutional by the law. Also, the Fair Labor Standards Act was put into effect in 1938. This was signed by FDR and basically just set hours and wages and stuff for the workers that they could write. I conducted an interview with a man named Joe Manning. He is from Massachusetts, and he gave a lot of credit to Hine and how pretty much sourced back to Hine the ending of child labor, although there were some other factors that helped him along. So, in conclusion, children back in the 1900s did not live normal lives. They were worked, even as young as 3 years old, they would work 12-hour days, which therefore led them to not being able to have a good future because they didn't get any education. Lewis Hine was hired by the National Child Labor Committee to try and stop this, and he took lots of pictures that were made famous and therefore let the public see into the factories that therefore stopped the child labor. Thank you.